I am Andrew Krug. I lead the security evangelism and advocacy team at Datadog. I'm also responsible for our security labs blog and things like our State of AWS Security Report. I'm joined here today by an all-star cast of panelists who I'll just go ahead and introduce in the interest of time savings, and they'll go ahead and wave. Trupti Shiralkar, engineering manager at Datadog. So we've got one Datadog employee on the panel here. Trupti enjoys watching 90s hacker movies in her spare time. Then next in line here, we've got Jay Bonsi. Bonsi. I said it right the first time, and then I second-guessed myself. CTO, Department of the Air Force, and his fun fact is that his first major programming language was, in fact, Perl, which says far too much about him. Any other Perl developers in the room? All right. Yeah, me too, believe it or not. Perl 4 on Windows. Next is Dr. Steve Ferdakis, who's the deputy CISO at Verily. Verily used to be known as Google Health Sciences. Steve lives in Austin, Texas, and volunteered as an EMT and is an aspiring pickleball player. And just to my left here, we have Anusha Iyer. I got that one right too. CTO and co-founder of Korsha. Fun fact about her is that she loves playing with Legos and constantly uses her kids as an excuse to buy and build all kinds of crazy sets. So as I said, all-star cast, variety of hobbies here, but we're here today to discuss the foundations of security leadership at scale. The most important part is at scale, because we're all in the cloud, which of course goes to near infinite scale. But we're gonna focus on kind of organizational design and what works well currently, what is going to continue to work well in the future, and what were we doing in the past that we just don't think is very good organizational design anymore, like what would we never do again. And we're gonna kind of walk through a variety of things. The first of which I think is architecture. I mean, I'm sure everybody here works at a place that has an architecture process of some kind. I mean, one would hope. But just curious, like show of hands, how many people would identify in the room as being a security persona? Like your primary role is security. How many people feel like their primary role isn't security, but you're still like kind of on the hook for it? All right, I'm curious about the folks that raised their hand for neither, but we'll go ahead and just dive into the question set. At the end of the session, we're actually gonna try and do this thing where we take questions from the audience. So if you wanna pop open your phone, go to the URL on screen and pose some questions for our great panel. You can upvote other folks' questions that you think are interesting, and we'll try to surface those. But let's just start with something that's pretty near and dear to me, something I've done a bunch of times, which is decomposing a monolithic application and moving it to microservices. So I'll go ahead and let Trupti kick off this part of the conversation. So Trupti, what do you think has changed in the move from monoliths to microservices in terms of the way that we have to think about securing an application?
That's a great question, Andrew. So folks, if you look back 15, 20 years back, we used to have these giant, tightly coupled monoliths operated by a bunch of teams. And fast forward 10 years, suddenly there is a rise of microservice-oriented architecture along with cloud, right? And now we are talking about serverless and low-code or no-code app. So if we see the architectural patterns are constantly evolving. When we used to deal with monolith applications, security used to be security team's business, and they would apply security at the perimeter, and standard authentication or encryption will go in. But when we break down those monoliths into multiple microservices, even security concerns and attack surface have become distributed. So that's what has changed in terms of security. New attack surface, more complex, more distributed. And now security has become everybody's responsibility, not just security teams.
So I want to talk a little bit about this though, because we still have monoliths, and we cannot get rid of monoliths. We sometimes we refer to them as ERPs, that they may expose microservices for some of their purposes or APIs, but we still live in a combined world of some monoliths that just happen to be, and some microservices that we embrace, and we feel that they have a lot to say about the future. What do you think?
The way that I often look at when you take monoliths and you decompose them down to microservices is that you're essentially doing the human equivalent of that. You're taking this very big team that's worked on a very big, super snarly product, and you're trying to decompose it down into social and team lines so that you get, it's sort of the organizational promise theory of this group is going to export this data to this other group. This group expects this from other groups, and you have to get your org lines right. But when you do that, security does become something that you either need a good set of centralized services to handle, whether or not it's sidecar type things inside of your application, whether or not it's a good set of common services or observability or other elements that you can kind of simplify that, because you're not going to have that hard security expertise everywhere, but you're going to need to be able to make it easy for developers in that highly distributed way. So there's a lot of elements to how, as you take those applications and you start to break them apart, about how you set up your teams and how you support them in order to be successful. But again, to your point, things like ERPs, there are some like hard, awful nuggets that are going to continue to be ugly for years.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. When we talk about microservices and decomposition, I feel like it has both helped and hurt security postures of organizations, right? So it's certainly helped in the sense that you can have almost this contract-based or this interaction-based structure where you can say, okay, I have this small microservice and its only job is to do this, and I'm going to focus on it doing that job really well and keep, unintended consequences, unintended interactions, or scope creep out of it. The flip of it is you have so many more connections, as Dhrupadi said, and so you do need a good way to manage the identity and trust between these connections, right? And that becomes, sort of an n-squared problem when you're talking about many interactions. Some, in some cases, a microservice, many cases, may act as both a consumer and a producer, right? Mm-hmm. And so that chain, that complex network topology, it's a lot of what we saw even this morning with, some of the visualizations with Datadog is the network, understanding that network topology and the communication paths in a microservice architecture is super important and does become everyone's job. Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting too, when we look at the difference between this monolithic application and a microservice application, that monolithic application still has those interactions. There are still security flaws buried there, right? And because you haven't made those promises or those contracts explicit, right? It's happening in some developer's head. You got to remember to make sure you're checking boundaries between, two functions, right? It's going from that tight coupling to the standardized coupling. So it's not that, it's harmed security. It's just made it more visible, right? We're being a lot more explicit about those interactions. The level of complexities is really, it's still there. Yeah. We're just bringing it out to the open.
Yeah, I'm definitely hearing some themes here, which are increased attack surface. You're always coming out of some crazy database to microservices, and then you're doing one of the worst things that you can do with sensitive data. You're actually just copying it to more places sometimes while you're in transition. And then we also have this sort of organizational design issue for contracts and whatnot. So I would just kind of pose the question to you. What do you think is important for an organization that is moving from monoliths to microservices in terms of the way that they're actually designing their engineering teams, designing not just org structure, but also process? What are two components maybe that are really, really critical? Anybody have a very strong opinion there?
I do. The number one factor we have to consider in mind is automation. how to make security self-service, automable, so that it can operate at scale. That's number one. And second one is developer security education. Security is not being taught at university the way we learn programming languages or algorithms or data store. And as a result, developers lack that education and they continue to make naive mistakes, continue to keep introducing vulnerabilities or insecure design flaw. So when we raise the bar of security by educating our developers and empower them with the right automation where they can do security at scale, along with just the way they do their UX design discussions or performance costs, those are the two things I feel, Andrew, are really important to match the speed of innovation in microservices world.
So we came here to talk about scale, right? So the main concept for all of us is to sit down and determine what is our security policy for microservices. Do not rely on the microservice itself to define or enforce or do anything about security. So in other words, you need to state that every microservice that will be acquired, partnered, whatever the word is, has to meet that security environment criteria and be very explicit about this. Communicate it, publish it, and expect that every microservice that will be deployed will meet it. That is essential if we're going to operate at scale.
I think it's a great idea. That's exactly what I was going to point out, Steve, is that, when you think about transitioning a monolith to a microservice architecture, it's an opportunity and it's a greenfield opportunity. And, I'll give you an analogy of, I have a startup right now, right? And so everything we're doing is pretty much greenfield and you start from nothing. And the first thing we did, being a cybersecurity company, is we codified our security principles, right? And literally write it down. This becomes like your rule of law, and then you have a system against which to automate, right? And I think that's super important. The automation is, as you were saying, I tell this with my kids, is I'll say, okay, we'll put rules in place, and then it's not me saying it, it's the system, right? And so you want the same thing when you're talking about automation and shifting left in your pipelines. You want the system to enforce the principles that you codify. So I'd say those are two really important things.
I'll kind of toss in here, being not in a startup, in the Air Force's 75th year, we have this problem where we have a lot of brownfield. And, we want to move to this microservices architecture. We want to move to an enforceable data fabric so that we can take and compose things from our institutional data, our partner data. And the problem is that you don't start from this baseline where everything is codified, everything is, you have a good strategy for your identities, you have a good strategy for your API or religion, you don't have good business rules, you don't have good documentation. And so the place at which we're starting is to say, okay, what is that data fabric layer that's going to start to enforce that on top of existing brownfield, right? How are you going to make it easy for data owners to kind of come as they are and come to a centralized service where you can start to enforce that, where you can start to make APIs on top of and normalize data access, right? We don't exactly know what the end products are going to be. We don't know how citizen data scientists and developers are going to kind of combine and build on top of these microservices, but we are working through this process of almost like data liberation out of these like deep, ancient apps, in some case mainframe applications, to pull that out and make it accessible. So I think regardless of whether or not your journey is you start new or whether or not you kind of build up from the ancient scary, it's again to set that foundation, get your common services in place, get your allow developers to be successful. They have to be aware of security, but it has to be easy to them. It's got to be something that's a part of the environment.
I'll just ask a quick follow-up there, because it sounds like observability is kind of a theme here. Anytime we talk about enforcement or standards or the way that we believe our environments are, sometimes that differs from the policy, procedure, practice. So I would ask the question to each of you, because I'm sure the answers are wildly different. How do you know, and like how do you observe that legacy stuff, especially at both startup scale and U.S. Air Force scale? Like what top line metrics are you looking at to say people really are following those guidelines or rules, procedures, whatever you want to call them?
Now that question was not in the list, all right? So now I have to think about this. So, okay. I think that, so there's going to be a little bit of opinionated stuff here, but let's make it fun for these guys that showed up. So I don't think that maturity cuts it anymore. This whole notion of we are at a certain level of maturity is a matter of, say, compliance to a certain rule. I don't see it. It's a certain metric that we could deploy only for certain parts of our security posture to say we're at the maturity level 3 because we follow the NIST framework. I'm not sure that that tells me much. But at the same time, it's not a binary thing to say we have security or we don't have security. So when you look at it from a perspective of discoverability, things go really tough because a lot of our environment is quite ephemeral. So therefore, the notion of knowing my environment, it becomes a matter of having some sort of registry at the time of the creation of the project, which we most of the times hope we do, but we're not very good at, especially how our applications are deployed, and especially when you bring in partners into the mix. So what it only leaves us with is continuous monitoring. And that means is, in essence, bringing the interval of validation to essentially nothing. You monitor your environment all the time. And it also means something that I was thinking about last night. It was almost like a sleep-inducing. The whole idea of how do I assign some sort of risk category to enclaves of data and applications that could combine old-fashioned architecture to modern architecture. So in essence, I know where my important stuff is. I continuously monitor to find new stuff that has just popped up. And based on certain semantics, I assign some risk value to them that will then translate to security controls. So I'm sorry, it is not a straightforward exercise.
I will say, and this may be controversial in the security settings, but one approach we're taking is not to have perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Like get at least a baseline of tools and technologies in place that do help you with the monitoring. And even if you have to set your baseline low and work your way up, chip away at it. It's better than not putting anything in place, right? And so we actually do a lot of work with folks on Jay's side, and they have an extremely, I think, interesting approach to what you call within the Air Force authority to operate, and like a notion of a continuous authority to operate. And what we've done as a startup is say, okay, we're going to start off by bringing in all the tools that are necessary that they use, just mirror what they have in their pipelines. And we may not start off at the same thresholds as them, but we work our way up to it and chip away at it, right? And so I would say, at least get it in there and have the data and have the ability to observe what's going on in your systems and just organizations. That's kind of step one.
Yeah, I really like that approach because you cannot protect if you don't know what you're protecting against. So observability, monitoring kind of becomes number one requirement compared to 10, 15 years back, where we relied more on traditional security controls.
So having one foot in the traditional security control world and having one foot in kind of the future, which is this continuous ATO world, we have a hard time bridging the two approaches, right? And so in a continuous ATO world, we focus a lot on culture, we focus a lot on agility, we focus a lot on time to remediate, we focus a lot on that cycle time as that velocity as being a key component of your resilience. And in the sort of traditional security control world, it is very much okay. Do you have a DR plan? Yes. Mm-hmm. Is the DR plan written down? Yes. Did you do it every 6 months? Right. And the whole concept of doing a DR plan every 6 months is completely anathema. Right. It's not. Those conditions aren't going to be met. Right. That's not realistic. But when you look at risk management and you have this risk management framework, which is what we have based on NIST, people warp that into a weird checklist and don't really use it to manage risk. They use it to manage a bunch of things. the organization is in a process of transition. We have this problem where we need to train my operators are, this may seem obvious when I say it, are like 19-year-olds, right? You know, they're like 19 to 23. They've just come out of school. We've trained them up. We said, okay, you are a cyber operator now. You have gone through a schoolhouse. You've been through 8 weeks of training, and we are going to throw you on the front lines. I hope you can catch nation-state adversaries with some tool set that we have. And that's a big task, right? And so observability is a key piece of this. But then we get sort of weird incentives about it, right? So everyone was like, oh my God, we need to observe stuff. And so we've like generated this huge mountain of data, and we've just thrown it in huge S3 buckets. And now we're standing over there looking at, you know, petabytes of data going like, oh, we should do a better job of monitoring that, right? And so now that we've gone through the scale of integration, now we're gonna have to go through the scale of like machine learning and to be able to really to be able to reach out and define products and services that are gonna help us get our arms around kind of that global scale. So it is, again, like just to totally double click, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Everyone here is going to be on a process of improvement, on a process of figuring out what works, figuring out like really what your raw security materials are, right? Culture, people, talent, tool sets, policy, figure out which one of those is the next thing to uplift. We all have toolkits. As leaders, we all have toolkits in our toolbox, and they aren't always one thing, and every organization, as they mature, are going to pick a different tool out of their tool belt to get better.
So I'd love to just follow on to that because you talked quite a bit about legacy systems and kind of like the things that you have to carry forward today to our next topic, which is identity and access management, which I'm sure that no one here has ever struggled with, right? So like let me just pose the question to you first, Jay. Like, what were we doing? What do we used to do with identity that we're not doing anymore? And how are we like modernizing this process of both like human identity and more importantly like workloads?
I mean, the flip answer there is Active Directory, but
that's the thing we're not doing ananymore.
That's right.
Okay,
right.
Just to be clear.
No, but so. They're hot takes. That's what panels need. We came from this in the DoD. We came from this world where everything was like PKI based, right? Where you had a hardware token, you typed your PIN. You don't type your PIN more than 3 times, or you're done for a few days. Everything was PKI based. And then as things modernized, we realized, there's not a great PKI story for mobile, and people like to work on mobile. There's not a great PKI story for actually most programmatic middlewares. It's hard to work with a PKCS11 container or something like that has your token in it, or derived tokens or whatever. But it's still the federal standard. So we're moving to a place where we need a better set of identity controls. We need a better set of authenticators. We have to worry a little bit more about the form factor of it. And before it used to be you are authenticated or not, right? We didn't do a lot of authorization. We didn't do a lot of risk-based management around identity. There wasn't a lot of context associated with your login. If somebody steals my CAT card and they log in from Stockholm, I'm not in Stockholm, so I can't physically jump that quickly across the pond. So maybe that isn't me. And so using other indicators around the context, around behavior patterns, these are things that are more in vogue about identity to truly determine who you are. We've inherited a lot of stuff from NIST, and that have become largely good practice around identity proofing, and there are some other good foundational stuff there that the government's done in that space. But having to make security convenient for people. The quote is something like, security has to be convenient, otherwise people will subvert it willingly or not. And identity is a huge piece of that.
Don't say that. You said PKI, 3 people walked out.
Oh, yeah, I know. That's right. Public key encryption.
So here's a funny story. So you want to do business with Google, right? So you're gonna send us one of those questionnaires you send. Those 2, please keep them below 200 questions. So you're gonna send us one of those, all right? So, and one of those questions would be, do you change your passwords often? And I say, no, we don't change our passwords, ever, okay? So the second question is, where do we store our domain controllers? And I say, we don't have those. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we sort of need to rationalize the amount of effort that it goes into certain operations that really offer very little. Do you allow BYOD? No, we don't. Because when we did, we found that all the same people will carry two phones or two laptops because they don't like an MDM on their personal stuff. So we say no BYOD, right? Which doesn't make us popular with certain partners, big consulting companies. Most of the times that they want to bring their own computers, but we have to give them our own. So the reason I'm saying all that is that when it comes to managing identity, we came and went into a lot of concepts, but we found that because of, and it had nothing to do with COVID, actually happened before COVID, that we said we have to be able to identify who you are in the context of what you're doing right now. So are you at home? That means I have to trust your home network. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to know that I'm managing your computer, and I do that by some sort of hardware token. And then you can do very basic stuff, you and also on your mobile device. But the moment you're going to try and do something else, then we're going to elevate. How do we elevate? Well, MFA, all right? And then when you try to edit stuff along the lines of actually accessing our code or committing code or even editing code, then I'm going to up you again. So it goes this way. And that all is aided by the fact that you actually have nothing on your computer. Your computer is essentially empty, is a vehicle to what is there. So the reason I'm saying all that is that obviously identity has evolved in certain cases and in some others have not. In my experience, it has been compounded by additional verifications along the lines of some sort of risk scheme as you navigate our environment. The other thing, though, it also became contextual. Mm-hmm. Are you at home? You're using a device we know, and other things that either determine some elevation of rights or something else. I still see a lot of problems with group management that proliferates over years, and it leads to projects that nobody wants to fund. And directory issues, whatever shape of directory you have doesn't really matter. That still hinders us.
Yeah, we're looking at Active Directory as a pretty big anti-pattern because you get stuck in this very tight mode of managing users and devices in a context-free way. You're either in the domain or you're not in the domain, and we're trying to look past that for what's next.
So can I ask for some audience participation on my response here? So I was looking at recently like Akamai's State of the Internet reports, right? That'll kind of talk through traffic distribution, shape of traffic moving across the internet and so forth. What percentage of traffic do you think is actually humans logging into systems as opposed to systems talking to other systems?
Anybody think 10%?
By bits or by hits?
1%.
Right. I mean, they claimed, and this was like a year ago, that over 87% or something was actually system-to-system traffic. It's not us going into browsers or applications or whatever it may be. I would say that number is probably substantially higher today, especially as we're moving towards, microservice-based architectures. So my biggest gripe with identity is we're focusing on the wrong thing. We need to be elevating machine identity to the same level as a first-class citizen with humans, if not more so.
I think machine identity goes just hand in hand with all the automation that we are doing in the cloud.
Right.
But is PKI the answer to that problem? Because last time, as was pointed out, when we said PKI, 3 people walked out. But
I almost did too.
I mean, there's all these issues, right? Like not just with the fact that it's crypto, but like managing this massive public key infrastructure that is like the best thing that we have for providing machine identity. So if it's not PKI, what is it? Anybody have a thought on what is beyond that for machine identity?
So I will say, I think, having worked in and with the DoD for a long time, I think they come about as close to making it manageable as possible, but it's still not manageable.
It's horrible.
And that's probably the largest scale of automation around PKI that you can think of. But I don't think there's anything wrong with PKI in general. I think if it's implemented correctly and with the right security hygiene and policies and so forth in place, it does give you strong cryptographic guarantees. I think what's called for is automating all of that security hygiene around it so that at the foundation layer, you may still have certificates, running around, but you and I never have to rotate a certificate or place a certificate, or, so you get the cryptographic principles, but 19-year-old in the field should never have to look at an X509 cert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the semantics that are different, because in a microservice PKI implementation, at least in our world, we refer to tokens that have a very, very short life. And because of the automation capability and the semantics of service to service, we can rotate them all the time. To a human, though, that is quite complicated because of just the distribution headache. So yes, the fundamentals are different. The fundamentals are the same because crypto is a crypto, but the capabilities that we see on a microservice, even just straight out of any sort of flavor of cloud, it's quite achievable with very little integration.
Yeah, it's definitely a step forward. I would say, when you take a look at some of the capabilities there, for example, service mesh architectures and things like that, you do get many steps forward. There's probably still some work to be done in terms of understanding what's happening under the hood, what's actually routing the tokens that are getting generated and all of that. Yeah,
PKI has a lot of positive properties that you would want in a credentialing and access management system. Revocation, which is dodgy at times, but still a useful function. Chains of trust, having a good sense of token provenance. But we're going to have to replicate those functions in some other scheme that we're still struggling with today, which is one of the things that really holds us back. We do some OAuth stuff, which gets us there, but it's always like, oh, we're going to use Steve's OAuth token, right? So this robot is acting on behalf of Steve.
Sense of identity. Yeah.
Right. And so in some cases that is okay, but it limits fully autonomous systems, and we can't rely on it.
So the way I see is 10, 15 years back, we used to have this blind trust when it comes to identity and authentication. We would just do authentication for the major actors, the human. And now fast forward 20 years in microservices or serverless world, we have to authenticate each and every entity, whether human or machine. So that blind trust is now replaced by zero trust. And trust needs to be earned by having, super security friendly technologies where the user should not feel any burden. So all the PKI and OAuth, that should be completely transparent to the end user. That's what I think.
I just want to quickly wrap up this topic because we're coming to the end of our time together here. And I do want to take one of the top voted questions from the audience, which is totally scary. But just to kind of close out this thought, we all started with identity, and it was literally you could walk in the room and use the computer. And that was your identity. You were physically in the space with the computer. And then all of a sudden, we had the worst identity ever, which is IP address as identity. And then that kind of evolved to usernames and passwords. Now we have context-aware access, this thing that Google kind of pioneered, and that's evolved to zero trust. So that it was big, broad spectrum of past to future in here. But to kind of close it out, we got one really interesting question, which is what do you each think is the right scale for an organization to have somebody that's literally accountable, in charge of running and scaling the security program? So when do you put that person in play, going from idea to startup, maybe to funded to enterprise? When do you put that person in play? You just want to start with Trupti?
It's very difficult to hold one person accountable for security of entire organization. I have usually seen security become successful only when everybody in the organization takes the responsibility and hold themselves accountable for the services they are building or services belonging to their teams or department. So I do not think so it is one person who can do the magic. Definitely it is not the CTO, CEO, or chief security officer of the company, but it's the culture. So we need to integrate security into DNA of engineering culture, and that's when we will able to drive that change, positive change.
Oh, I'm going to disagree. The nature of security and the nature of technology outstrips individuals' ability to do it. And to say that security is everybody's responsibility, I think is true in a surface sense. But at a certain point, you do need a deep thought to be able to say, okay, we want people to be aware of security best practices, but then we need to have somebody who does the actual, no kidding, thinking about, okay, how are we going to manage this in a secure, how we're going to manage that in a secure way, so that there is a certain specialization or division of labor that tends to have to happen, right? You do want a security aware culture, but all organizations kind of hit a specialization point, right? You wouldn't say cloud is everybody's responsibility. Well, it is sort of, but you're going to have sort of specialists. So I think there is a point in which you hit a time where there is an optimization to be made to say okay, we're going to help, okay, we're going to really design the internal identity service. You want a person who is very smart at that, who has the really insider knowledge to do that. So when if you were to press me for a number, if you have an organization that's 20 people, you should really think about having start to really, when you hit that specialization of labor point, you're not just in some sort of weird everyone does everything startup mode. That's about the time where you usually say, okay, let's take this seriously and get dedicated experts on board.
So security has been commoditized, and I want to get away. I don't want to be the security guy anymore. There was a time where we used to equate security, 100 denial, great, I earn my money today. But then I want to be called a risk assurance person now, because it is very complex across industries. If you are a startup gaming company, your risk is moderate. The moment you start collecting money, you just up your risk to, maybe you have to be PCI compliant. In other businesses, you start with collecting, like in my business, we run clinical studies for pretty much a drug you've used. So depending on your risk, you identify at what point you need to have measures to assure your company that your risk is taken care of. And that's a combination of technical skills, compliance skills, regulatory understanding, and so on. So this is how the role has evolved. And I do believe it's an early, in the story of a company, it's way early. And it will be driven by your current posture and what your risk is and what kind of skills and capabilities you're looking for.
Yeah, it's a great question going through this actually internally right now. So, being a cybersecurity startup, I think I had a little bit of security background that carried us for a while. But as soon as we hit in the realm, when we hit about 10 people, I wanted to bring someone on that held that hat, right? You want someone that is just like you're developing as a CTO or a chief product officer, you're developing a product roadmap. You need to have a parallel security roadmap to keep pace with it. And, it is about someone not just holding the concern, but bringing the thought leadership to it. I agree, it should be on everyone's minds, but there needs to be someone that's driving that thought leadership in the direction for an organization. And for us, being at the space where we are, we needed it kind of from day one. Like I said, we started with our security principles before we wrote a line of code. But it's got to be, it's very industry dependent. Perhaps, if it's a different industry, you can wait till you are bringing revenue in. But I would say it's probably earlier than that. If you think you would ever need to meet any compliance or regulatory areas, start a year earlier than you think you would need it.
So a variety of opinions there, all from scale out strategy to you should probably have it at 20, which is a very definite, confident number. So you all heard it here first, it's 20. But we're just about out of our time together today. Definitely thanks for attending the panel, Foundations of Security Leadership at Scale. I would love to have this audience back actually to have a hot debate on risk and what it means to you, and different ways that we could think about structuring an organization based on risk. So if you like this content, definitely fill out session surveys, give feedback about Dash to us. It's how we know how to program what we're gonna have next year. But let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to be here with you all today, and I hope you enjoy the other sessions at Dash.
Thank you.